Jenelle Esparza, and this is my studio.
Jenelle Esparza's Ancestral Archetypes opens at Blue Star on July 2nd. Walk through her studio with us as we talk about natural landscape and personal history. So this is kind of the area of my studio that is kind of the workstation. Everything laid out here are things that I am currently using, or just things that I like to stare at while I'm thinking on ideas. This one here, this little speed Graflex, is the camera that I used for Ancestral Archetypes. It's really nifty. It folds up into a box. And I personally just love film photography and specifically older cameras. So this is probably my favorite one. I have others, 4x5 cameras and whatnot, but this is probably my favorite. The quality, the photos that come out of it are kind of unique because it is so old and there's all kinds of dust and scratches that I usually leave on the photograph itself. I don't edit any of that stuff out. And it's convenient and easy to carry around. It's my favorite. This is the little film holder, that goes in there. Currently fresh film in here right now. We have ortholitho film, which is super easy and affordable, and I love it. This is the film that I use to shoot the abstract stuff. So this big piece on the wall right here, ortholitho, and also these photocopies from books about nature and books about the ocean and things like that. I just kind of have them scanned in and I digitally alter them to make these abstract shapes. In your statement, you describe how there is both ancestry and identity for people and for the landscape, trees, plants. Can you explain this a little bit further? So I think this whole theme of ancestry kind of draws back to my interest in palmistry and the idea that you can tell somebody's story in the palm of their hand. You can tell their characteristics, where they came from, what kind of traits they were born with, all just in the texture of your palm. And the same thing can also be attributed to nature. So you can look at the rings of a tree trunk and tell how old that tree is, or if that tree was ever sick. You know, it leaves this little mark in time, right? So you can look back on it. And you can also do that with light. You can look at these like little codes that are encrypted and everything, and you can tell the story and trace it back to something, or trace it back to some kind of origin. So that's where that ancestry comes from. This piece behind me here that are a little more abstracted, but it is the same theme, and I'm just using these textures and kind of morphing them into these abstract shapes and little islands. But it is the same concept. It all is still drawn from the same thing. And actually these pieces, I have several of these abstract ones. They've been hanging on my studio wall for several years, and I just kind of can stare at them and work on them from time to time. And then other projects are kind of drawn out of those. For instance, the Ancestral Archetypes was drawn from that. So I guess I kind of just play with different ways of playing with these textures and using film and photographs in different ways to either make something figurative or abstract. So this is several different pictures of geographical textures, and I select them out and layer them on top of each other and just morph and tweak them into these shapes that once it's right, it kind of feels right. I think I just keep messing with them and turning them around until they make these really interesting images, and then all the lines and textures that come out of it. I'm in love with them. So putting it on a transparency is kind of easy from that point because it's already digital. So then I just print it out on this transparency and I'll transfer it onto a silk screen and just run as many, probably do a small edition. These are kind of like small tests. So this piece here is, it's called Upside, and it is also derived from the same, photocopies of water texture. And I just kind of flipped them and layered them. And at the time I worked, at a print shop, and I printed these out digitally, but I would like to do more of a lithographic or, printmaking style, technique in the future with these. So once I printed it out, I kind of stared at it for several months and then just started adding different mediums to it. So there's Conte crayon, India ink, charcoal, gold dust, kind of like a gold medium, to add some contrast to it. And I just kind of played around and tried to mimic the shapes and really just kind of delved into the shapes and the textures that were coming out of it and tried to make my own and cover some up and, you know, kind of play with it that way. I tend to use a lot of oceanscapes and seascapes because I am originally from the coast, from Corpus. And I guess the longer I kind of stay away from that, I miss it very much. And I have to get my beach fix and kind of like take a trip every now and again. But it does draw from that original place where I came from. And, you know, it definitely draws from that.
How do you think that photography or the other materials that you're using, it's kind of interesting that it's something, the idea of like this history or this story about us or our ancestors being represented, you know, that's something that's very like abstract. That's an idea, but it's trying to represent that physically. So how do you think your materials connect to that?
Well, I think I've always been an image maker, and I've always been a photographer, and that's really the material that I'm so used to using. I mean, since I was really small, you know, whether it was making collages and trying to make imagery that way, because it's so literal and you can use it in so many different ways. I mean, like these abstract pieces are scanned pictures that I digitally morphed. And then Ancestral Archetypes is actual, just multiple exposures on medium format film, and just layering the pictures and playing with the contrast with each exposure. So it turned into this process where I carried my little, Graflex camera around and I carried it to each person's house. And then I would photograph things that are kind of in the surrounding area for the bottom exposure. And then on top of that exposure, I'd go inside their house and photograph their silhouette, usually it was in a window or a doorway or something that would backlight them. And that process was just kind of like a little discovery, right? So you can kind of walk around where they live and just discover and just look at whatever kind of nature they had, whether they had a garden and they had a green thumb and they were really, you know, connected to it that way, or some of them were like, well, I don't have any plants. You can try to find something around here. You know, they didn't really have any acknowledgement for any kind of nature that was outside of them. But I would find something. I mean, I would find grass or dirt, even whatever was there. So it did turn into this kind of process of, you know, shooting one thing and then on top of the other and, trying to put the two together that way.
Was it significant to do that kind of walkabout around the house or, you know, around their space first? And then did that walking around, you feel like inform where you maybe pose them for their silhouette or how you pose them for their silhouette?
It did actually, because, I mean, everybody had completely different style of houses and the way that they kept things. And these people, most of them I didn't really know that well. I kind of know them indirectly through someone else. And then the resulting composition kind of, you know, they give off these different emotions and these different feelings. I think each one has their own individual feeling per picture. that was kind of revealed in the way that they decided to pose, where they wanted to do the silhouette. Sometimes they already had a window that they wanted to use, what they decided to wear. Some of them really wanted to wear something specific, that meant something to them.
Even though it wasn't going to be.
Even though it wasn't, I was like, it doesn't matter what you wear because it's going to be a shadow. But they were like, no, I really want to wear this dress because it's my favorite dress. Okay. Whatever you want to do. Some of, they want their hair a certain way. I mean, it's probably more of like a,
the self-conscious.
Yeah, just because they're going to be photographed. But, some of them were really casual and were like, yeah, I'll just stand here.
So with the images and the layering of the women in their home space and the domestic space, and then layering on top of that the flora that surrounds the periphery of their homes, those are archetypal, which comes from your title, or even can be seen as stereotypical symbols for femininity. And obviously we can find those throughout art history, from classical painting to paintings from like O'Keeffe, or photography like Imogen Cunningham, or Anna Mendieta. So do you feel, is that art history or even that symbology, like that's something that you're trying to reference in the work?
I think that kind of organically kind of happened because I do love all of those artists, and I do really like symbolism, and all of that. And symbolism is all throughout art history, is really important, and it kind of signifies the era that piece of art came from, and also the culture and area, the world that it came from. So all those things kind of come into play with these portraits because they were about telling the story of this individual and where they live and what is around them, but kind of subliminally, right? So that's why I didn't really want to use a detailed portrait, because a detailed portrait's kind of literal. And then, so if I use this shadow, a shadow's a little more felt than it is seen. So it was a little more kind of like emits an emotion paired with these, natural objects underneath them. And then they created their own kind of symbolism in the end and the resulting compositions. I just think that maybe it says a little more about the person that I didn't know before, Is
the history of the silhouette kind of part of your reason for choosing to use them? This is going back to them kind of originating around and being very popular in like the Victorian era, where that's like, that's an era that is kind of in which women were oppressed. And we can say that that's always an era, but I mean, in this, it has its own, it has its own specific rich history, and, stories surrounding women. And so, and that relates strongly, that the image of a silhouette relates strongly to that era.
Yeah, so. It is. It was really popular then to do like a silhouette portrait. There were actually little paper cutouts that people would do at parties and stuff as entertainment. And it was really, really popular. It was sort of like the original likeness of someone before photography. So that is definitely something I was thinking about as the project. I wouldn't say that it was what started the idea of using a silhouette, because I wanted to use the shadow rather than the literal portrait. But that did develop, I started researching the word silhouette and just wanted to know, besides the Victorian era where it came from, and it actually derived in France. And it was the last name of like a finance minister who everybody hated. And the word silhouette used to actually be really negative in centuries past. And then over time, it just became this fun, party favor,
I think the emotional quality of them is really strong, and that combined with the layering kind of lends a narrative quality to them, which goes back to, telling their ancestry, or telling alluding to a story. Whereas that didn't necessarily, guide me to looking at them as portraits. So they do have a kind of a narrative quality to them, through their emotive quality.
Right. They are kind of, emotive, very much so. And I like that reaction because that's kind of what I wanted. These are actually, they're embroidery work, but they're originally my grandmother's drawings that she drew onto these pieces of fabric, and she would embroider these little maidens all the time. I took on some of her unfinished work and just started finishing it out on my own. So this actually isn't finished, but it's a work in progress, and I'm just kind of drawing on what she kind of left behind. And she's still alive, but these are just really old compositions. And I think it's super interesting what she decides to draw, like this woman backflipping, and it just kind of has a symbolism to me. And I didn't really want to embroider on top of it just yet, but I did sew it onto this other piece of fabric, and I'm still adding to it. But I guess it also derives from the ancestry aspect of the work that I do. A lot of it is kind of drawn on where we came from and drawn on an origin of sorts, where we originally derived and where we came from.